Hello and welcome to Roundtable. More than 5 years after hundreds of thousands of Rohingya Muslims fled Myanmar's military crackdown, the USA has declared it to have been a genocide. More than 6,000 people were killed in the first month of the onslaught. Why then did it take so long to recognize the atrocities in this way? Good to have your company. I'm David Foster. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said there was what he calls clear intent by the Myanmar military to destroy the predominantly Muslim Rohingya population. Since 2017, more than 700,000 Rohingya refugees have fled from Myanmar to Bangladesh. Myanmar's military government, which was sued in the International Court of Justice on genocide charges, says it rejects the US declaration.
The attack against Rohingya was widespread and systematic, which is crucial for reaching a determination of crimes against humanity. The evidence also points to a clear intent behind these mass atrocities, the intent to destroy Rohingya in whole or in part. That intent has been corroborated by the accounts of soldiers who took part in the operation and later defected, such as one who said he was told by his commanding officer to, and I quote, shoot at every sight of a person, end quote, burn villages, rape and kill women. Orders that he and his unit carried out.
While the refugees, in many cases, welcomed the announcement by the United States, experts say this must be followed up with what they call concrete steps. The Myanmar military government already faces multiple US sanctions. But will the US now do more against the Myanmar government? And how will this US recognition of genocide actually help the Rohingya people? Let us first of all go to Vancouver in Canada, and there we see Yasmin Ullah, a Rohingya refugee, now a Rohingya social activist in Washington, D.C. Dan Sullivan, Deputy Director for Africa, Asia and the Middle East at Refugees International. With me in the studio, I'm pleased to be able to say we can welcome Ronan Lee, author of Myanmar's Rohingya Genocide, who's a fellow at Loughborough University in London, and alongside him, Mabrur Ahmed, founder of Restless Beings, an international human rights organization supporting the world's most marginalized communities. Mabrur, I'm going to talk to you a little bit later on about, besides the Rohingya, who else in the world you would regard as deserving of attention when it comes to being marginalized. So let's make this a very open debate on that sort of thing. But Yasmin, let me come to you first of all. If I may paraphrase, you are now in Canada. You left the state of Myanmar when you were 3 years old. You went to Thailand. You had no status. You had to find that in a different country. You are not part of what we are seeing at the moment with the genocide, but you were persecuted. But you do have family there. What are you hearing from them, if anything?
Well, the current situation is not any better. I think that with the widespread of violence, we are seeing diminishing attention towards Rohingya. And just as recent as the past few months, the military has actually increased its penalization ability. That was, a precursor to many risk factors towards genocide. Hundreds of Rohingya have actually been sentenced to jail for 2 years, actually wanting to leave Rakhine State, because the situation in Rakhine State have been so fragile and so precarious that people are facing conditions that are just poor, and they're not able to actually access a lot of services. I think it's just the repeating of the cycle again and again.
Okay, Dan, I'll come to you in just a moment, but I want to bring in our studio guest right now. Talk to me, if you will, about not so much what this means from the United States point of view, because we will get to that in just a moment, but what does the term genocide actually cover as regards to the Rohingya people?
Well, the Genocide Convention, without boring the audience too much, has many different facets available to it. I think the key thing that really separates and segregates things like crimes against humanity and genocide is the intent. It's really the intent to destroy, in part or in whole. That's really the key significant difference. So What we're talking about so far as the US determination recently and the ICJ case that's happening,
International Court of Justice.
International Court of Justice case that's happening with the Gambia taking Myanmar to court, is really kind of trying to investigate, or the US has said that there is clear intent. Gambia is also arguing that there is clear intent to destroy, in part or in whole, the Rohingya community. So that's the real segregation, if you like, of the two things.
If you look at it without wanting to excuse it, what reasons do you think the Myanmar military and other people who may have done the same sort of thing, what reasons do they feel they have for acting in this way?
I mean, I don't want to paraphrase the military for obviously it's very far away from my opinion, but I think the real reason why they're perpetrating this on this community and other communities as well is because they want the land. You know, they value the land more than they value the people. In fact, it's not even that they value the people at all. They disregard the people entirely, which is the reason why you can have forced expulsion, mass killings, mass atrocities against this community because of the total disregard that the military have towards the people.
Okay, saw you nodding there. Well, what is it they want this territory for? This is up in Rakhine State, on the border with Bangladesh.
Well, Myanmar's military are xenophobic nationalists. Their leadership comes from a background where they believe that the country should be the home really only of members of their ethnic group, the Burma ethnic group, which is a Buddhist group. And on that basis, they've sought to Burmanize the country. They've persecuted the Rohingya. They've persecuted other groups, though, within Myanmar as well. I mean, not wanting to...
Well, we won't forget them. We'll come to that in another part of the programme.
These are people who want to make the country like them, and they'll persecute others to remove them. And in the Rohingya's case, because the Rohingya are mostly a Muslim group, they've portrayed them as a threat, as an existential threat to the practice of Buddhism within Myanmar, which is ridiculous. I mean, it's lunacy, but that's the argument that they've made, and that's what they use to justify the removal of the Rohingya.
I asked the question, what's being done about it right now? What's been done about it since it began by the outside world?
By the outside world, not a lot. I mean, let's call it for what it is. Not a lot has been done by the outside world. We've had great words. We've had really strong statements quite often from the outside world and from politicians. But in terms of doing things that will make a fundamental difference, and the one thing now that will make a fundamental difference to the Rohingya and other marginalised groups within Myanmar is getting the military out of power in that country. The number one problem for the Rohingya now and historically has been military power within Myanmar.
Dan, that's interesting. We're hearing about military power because for a while, Aung San Suu Kyi, who's now facing a very uncertain future with allegations of corruption, et cetera, and perhaps facing a long time in jail. For a while, she was the de facto, if you like, civilian ruler with the military in the background of Burma, Myanmar, and yet she refused to condemn this as well. Did that give the outside world an excuse not to take notice because she was, to some extent, such a revered figure?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we saw with the U.S. government's approach to this that there was a desire to leave some opening for the reformers, there was a feeling that you had to kind of turn a blind eye or at least minimize what was happening to the Rohingya, in the openings towards democracy or a pseudo-democracy, from 2012 on. When we first saw the attacks on the Rohingyas. So certainly that did close things down. I'd say one of the sort of silver linings of the coup that happened last year is that we've seen that different groups, including those in Aung San Suu Kyi's party, have increasingly showed empathy towards the Rohingya people and an understanding of, okay, we were wrong. What the military was telling us about the Rohingyas is wrong. We see that the military, what they're doing to us now, these attacks, what we could call crimes against humanity against people across the country, happened also to the...
But she did say, and it was only a few years ago, about 3 years ago, that there was no orchestrated campaign, that it was exaggerated and misconstrued.
Absolutely, and that means a problem. And as we look at a future for Myanmar, that's something that has to be addressed. What I'm saying is there are small steps where we see the national unity government, the opposition that has stepped up. they are recognizing the Rohingya to a certain extent and reaching out to include to some extent. But again, there's a lot more room for improvement and recognition of the Rohingya by the opposition.
I did explain before we came on air that you pretty much all four of you held the same sort of view. So I'm going to give you an opportunity, Mabrur or Ronan, to ask Yasmin if she thinks anything is being done and what she would like to see in terms of pressure from people such as yourselves to the outside world. I've almost asked the question myself, but please address her.
I think you're far more eloquent. But Yasmin, I mean, we know each other quite well. It must be absolutely exhausting being on this kind of advocacy trail to try and almost constantly get the Rohingya community recognition first and foremost before we even start moving kind of on towards genocide determinations and everything like this. I know personally as an activist as well, it's increasingly frustrating because the sooner that, the quicker that the story moves away from the headlines, the harder it becomes. So I mean, how do you feel that the Rohingya right now are being misunderstood and misheard?
I don't I don't really know how to answer that question, but I think that the more misunderstood we are, I think there's also an opportunity of us being able to educate people on who we are. And I think this ties back to why the genocide determination was so important. Because when we look at the determination of its own, we just look at the legal, technical meanings of it. But really, when it comes down to it, it is an avenue to humanize Rohingya, an avenue to emphasize the notion that we actually exist and we are deserving of better lives. It is also a space for us to create and emphasize our own roles within the Myanmar democratic movements, which is, still quite fragile and precarious given the historical disadvantage that Rohingya have been, and it's really, really important that we plan ahead of time for Rohingya to be included, not only within the civic space or the democratic movement or the nation building part, but also to revive some of the cultures and the literatures that actually go on to humanize Rohingya and emphasize our space and emphasize our ethnic status even more.
Yasmin, I will ask you what that misunderstanding is in just a little while, whether it's a general misunderstanding amongst people who don't know much about the Rohingya people or whether it's specific. But Ronan, I know that you wanted to say something as well, unless it's already been answered.
Well, what I'd like to say is just to ask a question of Yasmin. You and I are both pretty active on social media, and we've seen that young people in Myanmar since the coup have really engaged internationally with social media, and they've also engaged with the politics within their country. I mean, this is a country where 70% of the people weren't born when Aung San Suu Kyi first got involved in politics. It's a young country, and I think the future of Myanmar is its young people. And I guess the question I'd want to be asking you is, what do you want to see Myanmar's young people doing to help the Rohingya and to help their country?
First of all, I think that it's important for them to start thinking for themselves, and rather than listening or importing what the older generations have been through or struggled through, I think it's important to learn from the lessons of the past, but at the same time, it's important for young people to reimagine what kind of country they want to live in, and what kind of future they want to, they want to be creating. I think from the past, we've learned that sticking to culture or sticking to ideologies that have been passed down from generations to generations just does not serve us well.
Yes, Yasmin, this is one of the issues I want to. I understand what you're saying, but I do have to bring Dan back in at this point because I want to ask him about the notion of country and refugees. How are they coping within Bangladesh with the number of Rohingya who've felt it necessary to go over there, who've been driven there, and this notion of where do they belong? Is there any possibility that Bangladesh will allow them to have a particular piece of territory, will give them citizenship?
Well, thank you for asking that. I mean, I think that's a huge aspect of this and an aspect of the new genocide determination, because in addition to putting pressure on Myanmar, there is a need to rebuild or allow the Rohingya community to rebuild itself. And when you have 1 million people who are in Bangladesh, they need to have access to education, to livelihood opportunities, skills training, and we're seeing a lot of constraints on that right now. So I think even beyond talking about Bangladesh actually absorbing this or part of this population on a permanent basis, we have to talk about just getting them prepared to go back, which is what the majority of the Rohingya refugees want to do. I mean, we know that the conditions in Myanmar now are not conducive to a safe, dignified return, but that needs to continue to be the
Will
ultimate
they be
goal.
allowed to go back, do you think, if, as has been suggested in this studio, that the military is no longer there? Or are they going to be like the Palestinians, forever sort of wandering?
I think they need to be allowed to go back. I think that there's been some movement and recognition of that by the people who would replace the military, that they would accept Rohingya back. The question is, how many are going to be able to come back? Are they going to have the same kind of rights and are they going to be included in the new government? So I think that's a little bit longer down the road as we deal with the root causes of the military attacks. But in the meantime, we really need to open things up, especially with access to education, where more than half of the population in Bangladesh, the Rohingya refugee population, are children. I mean, so for the future of this community, like that's something that needs to happen very, very soon.
Are they always likely, though, to be marginalised, not just by a military government that may see them as a threat to their form of Buddhism, but by sections of the population that don't think they actually belong? Prejudice has to be got rid of.
Absolutely.
How?
If I can just build on some of the things that Dan was talking about as well. I think from the side of Bangladesh, there's a lot that needs to happen, and there's a lot that can't happen. I agree 100%, being on the humanitarian aspect as well. Education is absolutely key, and education is one of the big things that's hampered massively in Bangladesh. Like I said, once it's out of the headlines, the funding is stopping as well. There's less funding available. The international community needs to help Bangladesh in that regard, rather than just point fingers at Bangladesh, because at the end of the day, it is a country that's just taken on 1 million refugees. We squabble about 50 refugees here in this country. We're talking about 1 million large refugee population. That country, Bangladesh, needs support in order to build the infrastructure for a long term. There's absolute necessity for the Rohingya to go back to their land. It is their land. There needs to be reparation. They need to be able to go back to their own country, whether that's through this NUG or whether that's through international diplomacy.
being?
The National Unity Government, the new upcoming government that is supposedly going to replace this Myanmar regime.
And for those that don't understand, follow those events, when is that likely to be, and is it likely to be a smooth transition?
I mean, I'll let Ronan answer that question.
Okay.
In my opinion, I don't think it's going to happen very quickly, and I don't think it'll be very smooth at all.
Well, it won't be a smooth transition. It will involve removing the military from power, and that's not something that's going to happen quickly, and it's something that will take military...
By negotiation or by other means?
Well, the military said they will not negotiate. They regard the National Unity Government, the parallel government, the civilian government, the representatives of some of the politicians elected at the last election in Myanmar, they regard them as terrorists. Myanmar's military are not up for negotiation under any circumstances. This is all or nothing for them, and getting them out of power, though, will take time, but it's important that it happens, because if it doesn't happen, we're going to see the sorts of treatment that the Rohingya have received rolled out across the country long term.
But my question is, unless the entire country is against the military in the way that it handles things and is behind a national unity government, then the pressure from within the country is unlikely to be strong enough to get rid of the military.
Well, I think they are. I think it's really clear
Armed
within
resistance?
There is armed resistance. There's groups called People's Defence Forces. They've been the military suffered reversals at the hands of the People's Defence Forces. There's armed ethnic minority groups who've been taking on the military within Myanmar since the 1940s, 1950s. I mean, this is the world's longest running civil war. It's become much more acknowledged internationally since the coup last year. But I don't think it's a done deal that the military will win. I mean, this is a military that has, in the space of 12 months, systematically failed to convince the people of Myanmar to agree to the coup. the people don't want the military governing them. They just don't want them.
Should we ask Yasmin whether you consider that to be the kind of support that you want from a possible national unity government, from sources within the country but outside the current military rulers, or whether that could possibly be a hindrance, that it could distract from the plight of the Rohingya?
I think that it's important to not separate the issue of Rohingya to the rest of the widespread violence committed by the military. We're talking about the same perpetrator, and the perpetrator that has committed genocide has also, violated many other ethnic and minority groups within Myanmar. I think it is important to also highlight that without the resistance movement, there is also no solution to the Rohingya problem. The sustainable solution is to actually have an outlook that one day we will actually get rid of the military and reinstitute the democratic reforms or democratic institutions that actually work towards peace and stability for everyone, not just for Rohingya or just a few different ethnic minorities.
So, Dan, it's great that from the Rohingya point of view and activist point of view that the USA has made this decision, because in part it keeps it in the headlines for that little bit longer, but with all the events we're seeing in Europe at the moment, it may well disappear pretty soon. How hopeful are you that what we've seen from the United States will lead to something concrete? What might that be?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, first of all, I just want to recognize this is a very significant moment. It's been a long time coming. There've been a lot of people that have been asking for this. Activists like groups like Refugees International. We led a Call It Genocide campaign over the last couple of years. We have worked with Yasmin and other Rohingya activists. Have spoken to people on the ground in the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, and consistently they say this is not one of the number one things that they want from the international community is justice. And then they want to be able to go back home safely. So I think this is a first significant step that should be recognized, but it's not enough, clearly. It needs to be a catalyst for more, starting with pressure on the Myanmar military. We've seen a lot of sanctions, and the latest round of sanctions coordinated by the UK, Canada, and the US were welcome, but we can see more, particularly on the oil and gas industry within the state-owned oil and gas industries in Myanmar.
I get it.
And more on global arms embargo.
Well, I think China and Russia are still selling arms to Myanmar, if I'm not mistaken. We talked about marginalised communities, which the Rohingya are, but we also said at the beginning of the programme that we would give you, who works with a variety of different groups, not just within Myanmar, but around the world, the chance to sort of highlight, if you like, to put out there causes that we, the general public, might want to find out more about.
Absolutely. First of all, Ethiopia, we're looking at Tigray, and we have the Tigaru population facing almost the same type of vehement, vitriolic, violent action from a central government.
So Tigray province, right?
In Tigray, yeah, that's right, in Ethiopia. Also, we don't have to look too far away from Myanmar and look at India and the way that the Muslims are being treated there. There are early genocide warnings about the Muslim population across the length and breadth of India as well. I think these two are absolutely essential for us to be aware of. Also, I think it's really important to understand that in situations like Libya, where you didn't have necessarily an armed resistance, you didn't have a genocide determination, you had regime change because the international community, so-called, wanted that. You see across in Europe, you already mentioned in Ukraine, there isn't yet a genocide that has been determined, but we're already hearing signs of regime change. So what is it about this determination of genocide which doesn't follow up with things like regime change in Myanmar? We've seen
well, look,
the
what
appetite.
happened in Libya, I mean, be careful what you wish for
I'm
to
not
some
wishing
extent.
it. I'm not wishing it. What I'm saying to you is that there is precedent there from the international community that when they've seen fit...
If it wants to, it can do it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying.
Right. I want you just to sort of try and underline where we've been going and where we should go from here as we come towards the end of the programme.
Well, where we should go from here is that the international community should back up calls like the US has made with its genocide determination. They've made clear that, in their view, Myanmar's military's committed atrocious crimes against the Rohingya. They believe it meets the threshold to be considered genocide, that the intent was there. So now they've got to follow that up. I mean, their obligation under the Genocide Convention is to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. So they've got to prevent the ongoing genocide. I mean, genocide's ongoing for Rohingya within Myanmar. As Jasmine mentioned, Rohingya who tried to escape have been jailed by Myanmar's military. These are people who were trying to flee, have been thrown in jail. There's an apartheid-like condition that they face within Myanmar. There are concentration camps within Myanmar housing 140,000 Rohingya currently within Myanmar. And we need to see action to end that, to stop that. And that's got to involve getting the military out of power within Myanmar and bringing their leaders to justice.
Okay. Listen, thank you very much indeed. I know you're all on the same side when it comes to this, but you brought up a lot of very worthwhile points. Yasmin, thank you very much indeed. Dan, good to see you too, and thanks for coming into the studio. Well, I'm David Foster. You've been watching Roundtable. We thank you very much indeed, wherever you are, for sparing us the time and your interest. And we hope to have you as our guests on another occasion next time, I hope. Until then, goodbye.